In the Valley of Kings, beneath the desert sun, the dig site is in a frenzy. There has been a murder inside the tomb. The mummy is gone. Could this be murder? Or something else? Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones franchise. Hello everyone, and welcome to the show. In this episode, we will be covering Indiana Jones's very first adventure. We will be having a look today at the first episode of the Adventures of Young Indiana Jones series. The episode is titled, My First Adventure, quite appropriate. I figured that this would be as good a time as any to actually begin covering the stories from his youth, and I'm quite excited to get into it, so let us begin. We open on the Jones residence in Princeton, New Jersey in 1899, and Henry Walton Jones Jr. is born. We meet his parents, Henry Walton Jones Sr. and Anna Mary Jones. We also then see his parents introducing him to the new family dog, Indiana, an Alaskan Malamute, who Indy calls his best friend. For this whole opening sequence, Indy himself, young Indy, is narrating over a short montage of some of the things that he gets up to at a very young age, and they are certainly interesting. Firstly, we see that when he first learned to walk, he somehow ends up on the roof of his house, which is a double-story house. His parents aren't too happy, as you can imagine, and panic ensues, and his father has to climb up onto the roof to get him. We then jump forward and see Indy sneak out of a school classroom to join Indiana, who is waiting for him outside of the school, and they run off together. We then see Henry playing baseball in the street with some kids, and break a window by mistake when he hits the ball. We also see him and these other kids create a hot air balloon and have Indiana, the poor dog, inside as the test pilot, with all of them cheering him on. They also travel down a train track on a strange sort of vehicle that they've built to go along the track, and then see that an actual train is approaching from behind them, and they all panic and try to go as fast as possible. And then lastly, we see Henry on some sort of device that he's built in his attic to generate electricity, which then malfunctions and gives him a zap, with his hair quite cartoonishly standing on end. And just for the sake of easy listening, I've been referring to the dog as Indiana for now, but from this point on, Indy means Henry again, just to let you know, as very early in his childhood, Henry adopts the name of his beloved dog as his own, as a nickname. So, once the montage ends, we learn of Indy's father having one of his books become successful, and them all leaving to go on a trip around the world for his father's lecture tour to all the different universities. And Indy is of course sad to leave Indiana, the dog, behind, but is nonetheless excited to be traveling the world with his parents. He is 9 years old at this point. And so they travel by steamship across the Atlantic, and their first stop is Oxford, where his parents acquire a tutor for young Indy to ensure that his studies continue while traveling. This tutor is an older woman named Helen Seymour, who taught Indy's father when he was younger. Miss Seymour at first declines the offer, as she feels Indy is far too young, but his father manages to convince her by telling her about how she will get to see the world as she always wanted. Miss Seymour is a great character in the series. Her and Indy obviously spend a lot of time together with all the studying, and upon their meeting she is very strict and cold towards him, and he is no more excited to be spending time with her as she is with him. So, from Oxford, they travel to their first destination, which is Egypt. They travel to Alexandria and then travel to Cairo from there. And the basic situation when it comes to who's with who is that once they arrive at a location, Indy's parents leave together for his father to go and give his lectures, and also for them to go to social events that are a part of the tour, such as dinners and, events with important people or operas, concerts, that sort of thing. While Indy and Miss Seymour are left together. They stay behind for her to tutor him and make sure that he does his studies. And when he is not studying, she would also take him on small trips to see the sights around wherever they are. And upon arriving in Cairo, they do just that. As one day, as Indy is finishing up his studies, Miss Seymour asks him if once he's done, he'd like to go and see the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza, and of course he would love to. So he and Miss Seymour travel to the pyramids with a guide, and once there, Miss Seymour then has the idea for them to climb to the top of one of them. But so that's unexpected. We see that though she's a very professional and academic lady, she also has quite an adventurous side. I'm sure climbing those is very illegal, and even back in 1908 you'd more than likely run into some trouble. While they are climbing the pyramid, their guide is just shouting up to them. He's just losing it, and they can't understand him, of course. And, he says to Miss Seymour, he seems mad, and she's like, not to worry, Henry, he'll be perfectly content when we get back down. And that's a very odd assumption to have, to just assume that he would be okay, because he is very much not. Anyway, they make it to the top of the pyramid and spend a moment looking out over the view of the desert. And upon looking down, they see that the guide is now leaving with their camels. By the time they hurriedly climb down the pyramid, he is gone. And so they are wondering now what to do, as they are all alone. At this point, a man comes cycling up to them from the desert. He greets them and introduces himself. This is T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, a British archaeologist and colonel in the British Army. He became well known in history for his exploits in the Middle East. And anyway, so they get to meet him, so that's pretty cool. He makes a campfire and spends the night speaking with the two of them. He and Indy have a few discussions. They discuss the monuments around them, they discuss mummies, and the different cultures' beliefs regarding life after death, and Indy finds all of it very interesting. Lawrence then offers for Indy and Miss Seymour to accompany him to a dig site near the Valley of Kings, which a friend of his is working on. They are both excited at the thought, Indy more so of course, so the next day when they return home, he asks his father for permission to go off with Miss Seymour to see this site. His father allows it and gives him a journal and tells him to write anything down that is noteworthy. That is just super cool. I love little journals and tomes, that sort of thing. The journal that he gets has a very cool design on it as well. So Indy and Miss Seymour travel on a riverboat or raft kind of setup with Lawrence. He tells Indy that whatever country he travels to, he should always learn the language, referring to it as the key that unlocks everything. And this is something that Indy evidently takes to heart, as we know he learns many languages throughout his life. So once they arrive at the dig site, they are greeted by a man named Rashid Salam, a very friendly man. He tells them that they have just found another tomb on the site. A man named Demetrios then uses dynamite to clear the entrance to the tomb as they all watch. Cautious for signs of poison gases which can accumulate in underground chambers such as this, Indy and Miss Seymour join a group in entering the tomb with torches. And I'm not talking about flashlights here, these are proper fire-on-stick torches. So a very classic tomb delving scene here. It's pretty cool. They find that this tomb belonged not to a pharaoh, but an ancient architect named Ka. They open the sarcophagus, and Indy sees his first mummy. He is quite afraid of it, and thinks that there is a curse on the tomb. This is a curse that he had heard of earlier. They notice that there are no artifacts in this chamber, so they figure that there must be a secret chamber somewhere. After a few moments of searching, they find it, a hidden doorway in one of the stone walls. Upon pushing it open, poison gas begins to leak out, so the whole group very hastily retreats to the surface. They plan to re-enter the tomb the next day, once the gases have cleared, and Rashid Salam says that he will stand guard over the entrance himself. He is told by Lawrence to draw a gun from the armory just in case. Indy asks him if he can join him in guarding the tomb, but Rashid says that though it's very brave of him to offer, he'll be alright. That night on the dig site, Indy spends a restless night in his tent, jumping at every sound that he hears outside the tent. And then the next day, the camp awakes to find the entrance to the tomb unguarded, and Rashid is nowhere to be found. They all enter the tomb to look for him, and find that the mummy is missing from the sarcophagus, and just beyond that, they find Rashid, brutally murdered. He appears to have been burnt, but also struck in the head with something, and Indy sees this. He sees death for the very first time, something he would see much of during his life. They find that some strange silver powder is on Rashid's body, and Lawrence takes some in an envelope to investigate later, but Indy is convinced that the curse is responsible for this, as a part of the curse previously mentioned reads, "He that enters my tomb I shall burn with my fire," so he's put two and two together and he's quite certain of what's caused this. His theory is evidently shared by many of the other workers on the site, as upon learning what had happened, most of them flee. That night, Lawrence enters the tomb again to try and find any more evidence or clues. Indy and Miss Seymour go down with him. In the secret chamber that they previously discovered, they find a stone bust of Carr, sort of seeing, oh, well, this is what Carr must have looked like when he was alive. Lawrence reads some of the ancient writing on the wall, and through that they find out that Carr, for his great service to the pharaoh, was given a precious headpiece, the sacred jackal with eyes of fire, as it's called. However, the bust of Carr in the chamber does not have a headpiece on its head, even though this is seemingly the purpose of this bust is to display this headpiece. But they can clearly see that something was on the head previously, but had been broken off, stolen. They now know why Rashid was murdered. Now it's just a matter of who. Later on, in the tent, Lawrence draws out what the headpiece might have looked like on a scrap of paper, and gives it to Indy. The whole eyes of fire thing is in reference to the eyes of the headpiece having precious stones in them. Lawrence then looks into the strange powder that he had found. He decides to put a match to it, and it ignites instantly with a flash. It is a photographer's flash powder. They decide, after this, to investigate the on-site photographer. While following the man around, they see that he enters the tomb by himself. They follow him inside, and Lawrence confronts him with his gun, but they learn that he was only down there to secretly take more photos of the tomb in order to sell on the side for more money. He's not the culprit, but he tells them that he is not the only person to use flash powder on the site. Demetrios, the one with the dynamite. He is the culprit. Also, just a small note here. When Indy follows the photographer into the tomb, he's trying to be quiet and sneak around, and he ends up accidentally discovering a sort of small hidden chamber where he finds the mummy. The mummy had been stored away in this small chamber, presumably by Demetrios, as along with the mummy they find what seems to be pieces of dynamite equipment. Their new suspicions are confirmed when they find that Demetrios has just fled the site, leaving his tent empty. Lawrence takes his bicycle and races off after him. Now, I thought that Demetrios would be quite a distance away by now, but apparently not, as we see him quite nonchalantly just riding along on a mule or donkey, being caught completely off guard by Lawrence, who runs up behind him and tackles him off his mount. The two men tumble down the sand dune, and after, Demetrios is questioned by Lawrence, and he reveals that he no longer has the jackal headpiece, that he has hidden it, and that they will never find it. So this whole situation with the jackal headpiece is just left off at this point. We can assume that Demetrios was turned over to the authorities, and that the trail of the jackal headpiece unfortunately has gone cold for now. We then cut to a market by a dock, where Indy and his family are boarding a ship. They are leaving Egypt. Their next destination is Morocco. Before we continue the story though, we will just hop over to the mid-show break. I will see you there.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Why hello there, and welcome to the mid-show break. This is just for me to talk about the show itself, along with some other things. Firstly, I'm Kel, or Sir Bandit, the host of the show, and thank you so much for tuning in. This is the first time on the show that we are covering an episode from the TV series, but we will not be consecutively covering all of the other episodes after this one. As I've said before, my plan is to jump around from story to story and catalogue Indy's adventures from all over the franchise media. One of my reasons for doing this is you've probably noticed that an adventure from the Young Indiana Jones show has a very different feeling from one of Indy's adventures from when he's older. While the stories are exciting and interesting, the Young Indiana Jones stories feel more wondrous and childlike, of course. So, in future, I will be spreading these different adventures out amongst each other, so that you get a bit of this and a bit of that, and it's not too much of the same thing for too long. Lastly, if you're enjoying the show, share it around, and leave a rating or review wherever you're listening. It helps a lot. Speaking of, we actually have a review to read out on this episode. It is the first review that's been left on the show, so it's super exciting. The review comes from Midwest Gamer, and they say, "Fantastic! While listening to Tom Robot's podcast, he mentioned this channel. I decided to give it a go since I loved the first 3 Indiana Jones movies while watching it with my dad in the 90s. There is so much information that I didn't know. I'm excited to hear more about the world of Indiana Jones. Fantastic work." Thank you so much, Midwest Gamer, for taking the time to leave a review and for the kind words. What an amazing franchise to have nostalgic memories of like that, like watching them with your dad. That's great. It's really great. And I'm glad that you're enjoying the show and that you're excited to hear more about the world and the other crazy stories of Indiana Jones because, well, there's going to be plenty of that. So thanks again, and I'm glad to have you listening. Also, thanks Tom for the shout out. If you'd like to have your review or message read out on the show like this one, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and I will be reading it out on a future episode. You can also reach out via email, Twitter, or on the Robots Radio Discord, where you can come and hang out and, just say hi on the Indiana Jones Lorecast channel. So, look forward to seeing you there, and links to all of that will be in the episode description. Now, without any further delay, let's continue with our story.
I'm going after that truck. Oh. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
On the ship, Indy's father explains that while in the city of Tangiers, they will be staying with a friend of his, Walter Harris, who is a correspondent for the London Times. And once they arrive, they meet Mr. Harris, and while talking with him, they learn that they will go to meet Emily Keane, the Sharifa of Jebel, an Englishwoman, who came over to Morocco and married the Sharif, giving her a position of power there. Though the locals weren't fond of her being a Christian woman, they eventually had to learn to tolerate her due to their respect for the Sharif. They travel to meet with the Sharifa for tea, and once they arrive, we see that there are several household slaves on the premises. While they are all sitting down for tea, the Sharifa suggests that perhaps Indy can be taken to play in the garden by one of the slaves in the dining room, a young boy named Omar. Indy jumps at the opportunity to get away from the boring formalities taking place at the table, and he and Omar spend a while playing in the courtyard garden, throwing an orange around and having a good time. We see some interesting interactions here between the two boys as they hit the orange around on the floor with sticks in a sort of hockey kind of way. Indy says to Omar, "Oh, 3-0, you'd better score or I win." And Omar responds by saying, "Do you wish me to score?" And he says, "Well, I want to win." And Omar says, "Oh, as you wish." So Indy says to him, "Wait, no, I want you to try and score, but you don't have to be all polite with me." And as they continue playing, Indy learns that Omar doesn't go to school and does not have to study. And Indy's basically like, "Oh, you don't have to study? Wow, you're lucky." So we clearly see here that Indy does not actually know what being a slave means. He has no comprehension of it. We learn that from the Sharifa's home, the group will be traveling to meet the Sultan. And when the family is leaving the Sharifa's home, Indy's mother mentions that he hasn't had anyone to really play with on this long trip. So the Sharifa, in response, allows Omar to leave the house and accompany Indy during the duration of his stay in Morocco, and both boys are excited by this. While riding on horseback through the desert, Indy tells Omar of things such as mountains and snow, as Omar thinks that everywhere looks like this, desert and heat. And Indy shows Omar a map that he had drawn of the world, and he is amazed by all of it. They also discuss ambitions, with Indy saying that he's going to be an archaeologist when he grows up. When he asks Omar what he wants to be when he grows up, he says, well, a slave. And Indy says, no, I mean when you grow up. And Omar explains to him that a slave is born into his life and cannot leave it. It appears at this point that Indy finally is understanding, and he looks troubled. Later that evening, the group stops to make camp, and while around the table, Indy brings up his thoughts that are troubling him, and the Sharif, who is sitting at the table, tells him that if Omar were a peasant, his life would be much harder, and that he is better off as a slave. Miss Seymour then speaks up in response to this and says how she believes that nobody would ever trade their freedom for a roof over their head, no matter how nice the roof is. The Sharif is clearly a bit agitated by this and says, well, you're from a different culture, Miss Seymour, and she responds by saying, but the human spirit remains the same everywhere. Indy's father says how slavery was accepted through most ancient civilizations, and that the idea of not having slaves is still a relatively new idea. Indy asks, well, what if Omar doesn't want to be a slave? And is told, well, that is what slavery means. He has no choice. He is property. He is, of course, further troubled by all of this. Later on, the two boys are talking, and Indy tells Omar about things like the ocean. He also tells Omar that he does not need to ask his permission to do everything, or bow to him. He says that around him, he's not a slave. They are friends. It's a very sweet moment between them. They then arrive in the city, and once at Walter Harris's home, the two boys are getting ready to play a game, when a man enters the house. Indy, seeing this, thinks that it is a thief, but it is actually Walter Harris in disguise. He shows Indy that along with wearing local robes and clothing, he uses walnut oil to darken his skin in order to blend in with crowds. He says that an Arab can gather information here much easier than a European. Obviously, since Europeans in a place like Morocco stand out like a sore thumb. Harris mentions to Indy that while in the market he had seen a severed head on display. This was a man who had displeased the Sultan in some way. Indy asked what the head looked like. He has some sort of a morbid fascination about it. Later on, the adults all leave the house to go meet the Sultan, and Indy is left with studying to do by the time they get back. Of course, though, Indy does not do this. He instead asks Omar if he wants to go with him to the market so that they can try and see the severed head. Not the brightest plan, but they're going with it anyway. Omar helps Indy with his disguise, as Indy uses the walnut oil as Harris had earlier to darken his skin. The boys then head off to the marketplace. They wander around the market for a while, with Omar asking directions to the head. A man approaches Indy while they are doing this and tells him to follow him, because he knows where the head is. Indy goes after the man, very excitedly, but Omar reluctantly lags behind the whole time, as he is more wise to things like this. He doesn't trust the man. Indy is then led to a secluded spot where he is grabbed and bound by a group of men. Omar manages to not get caught, but instead of running away, he actually tries to get back to Indy and free him, but is caught himself in the process. The two boys have been kidnapped. The adults all return home to find the boys missing. Mr. Harris sees that his walnut oil has been used and figures out what has happened. He travels to the market with Indy's father, and after a while of asking around, he's finally told by bribing a bystander what happened. And they then rush home, and Harris says that he will go after them as he knows where the boys are being taken. And when Indy's father says that he's coming too, quite insistently as you can imagine, Harris declines his help, saying that he can move way faster and more discreetly while alone. He tells them that he had shown Indy the walnut oil and how it is used, and so he would feel responsible if something were to happen to the boys. He then applies the disguise himself and heads off to find them on horseback. As the boys are being transported, they see that there are many other children with them. These men are bandits who kidnap slaves in order to resell them illegally. The morally bankrupt bastards. Selling slaves is fine, as we all know, but selling slaves that aren't yours, now we have a problem. So during the night, these bandits are killed by another group of bandits, who then take all of the children themselves to a shady-looking settlement where the slave auctions take place. They are all treated quite roughly, and Indy is of course terrified, while Omar says that all they can do is pray that they go to a kind master. The next day, the slave auction takes place, and we all know how auctions go. You have the crowd of bidders, and there is a stage in front of them, and these poor children are led up onto the stage one by one, and they get auctioned off. So it eventually comes time for Indy to be auctioned. So he's poked and prodded and thrown up onto the stage, where he sees that Walter Harris had actually found him. He had tracked them down, and he is, in his disguise, standing in the crowd and bidding to try and buy Indy back, as there is a whole crowd of people here. It's basically a whole city, so fighting their way out of this is completely out of the question. So his only option at the moment is to just try and bid as high as possible and try and win him back. So while trying to do this, there is another man in the crowd who is constantly trying to outbid Mr. Harris, because he's interested in taking Indy as his own slave. So he eventually manages to outbid this man, and he is then given Indy. So he leads Indy out of the auction area and reprimands him for being so stupid, understandably. Says how worried his parents have been, how worried they've all been. And Indy is very sorry for what he's done, obviously. Gosh, he's definitely been through an ordeal already. So he asks Mr. Harris if they can perhaps buy Omar as well, because he doesn't want to leave Omar to just be sold off to some random person. Mr. Harris tells him that he had spent all of his money, most of his money, buying him, and does not have enough to buy a second slave. But Indy convinces him to try at least, so the two of them re-enter the auction. Once back in the crowd, they wait for Omar to be auctioned, and once Omar is thrown up onto the stage and the bidding begins, Mr. Harris begins bidding, putting his bids in, though he has way less money than he did before, not that anybody else knows that. So again, we have a very tense scene as that same man from before keeps upping his bid to try and outbid Harris, because he's also interested in Omar, because of course he is. That's how this is going apparently. So as the bids are rising, the price is getting very close to the maximum amount of money that Mr. Harris has to spend. And Indy at this point gets a pretty clever idea. Indy is not fluent in Arabic, but he's picked up some of it, and he knows enough to get by in this particular plan of his. So what he does is he speaks up quite loudly and speaks to Mr. Harris, playing the role of the slave, and basically asks him, "Master, why are you bidding so high?" And Mr. Harris responds, also in character, clearly just going along with this act. He asks him angrily, "What do you mean?" And Indy says, "Well, this slave is a mute. He can't speak. Why are you bidding so high? He's not worth that much money." And they're obviously having this back and forth very loudly so that all the other bidders can hear this. And the man who was trying to outbid Harris this whole time is suddenly very relieved that he hadn't bid higher than Harris here, as Harris is very loudly exclaiming, also in Arabic of course, like, "Well, someone else had better outbid me on this slave, because I will not be made a fool of." And obviously the other man does not outbid him, feeling quite proud of himself, feeling quite clever, that he had avoided buying such a worthless slave, as I'm sure he would think. So they manage, with this whole plan, to actually secure Omar, and he then goes to Mr. Harris. And Mr. Harris, finishes off this whole act of theirs by angrily saying, "Oh, you'll be punished for this later, why didn't you speak up sooner?" And he even gives Indy a fake slap upside the head. It's all quite a performance. Mr. Harris and the two boys leave the auction then and are getting on horseback to leave. And, of course it does suck that though the two boys are safe now, there's still hundreds of children left in this auction to be sold, but there's nothing to be done for it. It's a really, really unfortunate situation, but for the time being, Indy and Omar are safe. Well, not quite yet, as while they are preparing to leave, Omar is of course thanking them, and that same man who was trying to outbid Harris in the auction happens to walk down that pathway and hear him speak. So, of course, they wisen up to what has happened, and a whole crowd begins to chase them. So they sort of do what? Oh, he can't speak, it's a trick, so they are chased out of this really shady settlement. Upon arriving home, Indy is reunited with his parents and Miss Seymour, who are all, of course, happy to see him, see that he's alive and well. And it's a really emotional reunion, as I'm sure you can imagine. Then the time comes for them to leave Morocco, and the preparations are being made, and while they are all saying goodbye, Omar is told by the Sharifa to go and continue with his duties, and he then says goodbye and walks off. But Indy, not being content with that, runs out after him, and as the adults continue to say their goodbyes to each other, the two boys talk for a moment. Indy tells Omar that he hopes that they meet again, as he'd like to show him the mountains of Switzerland or the ocean. Omar thanks him and tells him that he has given him dreams to dream. He says that though it is not his place to see or to go like Indy, he at least has dreams. Indy gives Omar his map. Omar says at this point that he needs to get back to his duties, and out of habit he goes to bow, and Indy stops him, reminding him that friends shake hands, and so they do, and they then part ways. And as they part ways, our story closes out, with the two boys waving back at each other. I was very surprised by this series and where it goes at times. It was my understanding when first watching it that it is a children's edutainment show, a fun story that teaches you things at the same time. And as I said before, there is a more childlike and light-hearted overall tone in the young Indiana Jones stories, and yet it still explores themes such as slavery and different cultural beliefs on certain matters, and the story ends sometimes without a fully happy ending. There is no magical ending here where Omar is freed from slavery or all the other children at that slave auction are freed in some way. It all feels quite grounded in that way, and you also get some pretty heavy imagery at times, such as the violent murder that happened in Egypt. It is really great, in my opinion, that the show does not shy away from such things, even in depicting Indy's younger years. But that is going to be the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the end. I do hope you enjoyed it, and have a great week. And if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, if you're looking for a cheap alternative to a ball, Moroccan oranges are the most durable fruit on earth, apparently. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.